City of Northglenn, Channel 8, keeping you informed of events in your community.
Everyone, and welcome to the December 18th City Council study session. Joanna, would you call the roll, please?
Mayor Dodge.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Escobar.
Here.
Councilmember Sowers. Here. Councilmember Lighty. Here. Councilmember Downey. Here. Councilmember Brown. Here. Councilmember Whitman. Here. Councilmember Duran Mollica. Here. Councilmember Wilford. Present.
All right. We only have one item tonight, and that is our City Council orientation, so I will hand it off to Jim and the staff.
All right, so Mr. Hoffman, our city attorney, is going to be first, and then Ms. Small, the city clerk, and then I'll bat, I guess third, not clean up, but I'll hit last and walk through my items, and then obviously we can stop at each interval and take questions and just have this be an interactive discussion. So Mr. Hoffman.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. This is my opportunity once every 2 years to go over kind of a general orientation geared more towards the context of a legal framework for your role as Mayor and City Council. So as you can see, this was put together before the before we knew when certainly who our last council member was going to be, when we thought the orientation was going to be on December 4th. So my memo references the original date of December 4th, but this is very similar to the memo that councils have been given for years, every 2 years, that is the orientation. But this is intended to be an overview. This is intended to be good bedtime reading. If you have insomnia after tonight and need help, this is guaranteed to put you to sleep. And so what I'm hoping to do is just hit the high points. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please by all means interrupt me. And I'd much prefer this be interactive to the extent you have questions. But what I like to start with is what the City of Northglenn is. And the City of Northglenn is a home rule municipality. That is significant because not all cities in Colorado are home rule municipalities, and a home rule municipality has a great deal of what's known as plenary or organic authority. What that means is that Northglenn's authority is derived from the Colorado Constitution, which says you can have a home rule charter, and your home rule charter is the city's constitution. So it is akin to your constitution on what are known as matters of local concern. If a municipality is a home rule municipality, such as Northglenn, to the extent a matter is something of local concern, you can deviate from state law. Historically, what has happened is that there has been a desire by many for what I'll call uniformity. Uniformity is an attack on your home rule authority. So for example, historically you've seen things like red light cameras, where courts have found those to be matters of statewide concern as opposed to home rule authority. But there are certain areas of law that have retained their home rule character. Probably the most significant is land use, but there are others such as home rule authorities have the ability to impose different types of taxes, for example, than do statutory municipalities. And oftentimes, the decision about whether something is local in nature and thus something that you can legislate on independently from the state is going to be on a case-by-case basis. But you have that authority when something comes up that is a matter of local concern to deviate from state law. There is also something known as a mixed matter of state and local concern. On that, again, you can legislate You just can't deviate from state law. And if matters are matters of state concern, you're stuck with state law, essentially. Our charter establishes what's known as a council-manager form of government. So essentially, the city manager is the CEO of the corporation, and you all are the board of directors. How does that work in terms of the relationship with your lawyer? Well, it's not necessarily what everyone thinks, because my client is not the citizens of Northglenn, even though I am the Northglenn city attorney. My client is the city of Northglenn by and through its city council. So you all, the 9 of you, as a body, are the client, not the citizens of Northglenn. And that's an important distinction because, for example, if a citizen calls me and asks for legal advice, I don't return that call because the citizen is not my client. You all are my client as their representatives. As it relates to our charter, being the Constitution, ordinances that are adopted have to be consistent with the charter. Now, much like the Colorado and the United States Constitution, the charter does not address every possible issue that a city could legislate on. But what you can't do is legislate in a manner that is inconsistent with the charter. Again, inconsistent with the Constitution. And the charter can only be amended by a vote of the registered electors of the entire city. It can be done in a couple of different ways. It can be initiated. In other words, the citizens can seek to initiate with a petition to have the charter amended, or you can put a charter amendment on the ballot. It can be done either way. Again, the legislative affairs of the city are vested in the city council. So you are the legislative body of the city. And it is the city manager's job, through the city manager and his staff, to implement your policies. That is sort of the way you go from the policy perspective down to the implementing and handling the day-to-day affairs of the corporation. You deal with it at the legislative level, and as we'll talk about a little later, the quasi-judicial level, and it is the staff's job to implement your policies. So what I try to do is hit on a couple of high points that I think, A, are sometimes counterintuitive because when you get into government, the rules are a little bit different, and B, issues that continue to come up over and over again. So you'll see that I'm going to focus on a couple of those issues. The first is open meetings. Our open meetings are actually governed by the charter. So we have a specific provision in the Northglenn Home Rule Charter that addresses open meetings. By contrast, the Northglenn Urban Renewal Authority is an entity created by state law. It actually has different rules than the city does. It doesn't act in accordance with the charter. It is required to act in accordance with state law. So there is a great deal of overlap between what state law requires for open meetings and what the charter requires, but again, the charter governs. So our section 4.5 of the Home Rule Charter says, all regular meetings of the City Council shall be open to the public, and citizens shall have a reasonable opportunity to be heard under such rules and regulations as the council may prescribe. So that is the city's open meetings law, and then the city in its charter, which is pretty unusual, actually has specific language regarding executive sessions. So, for example, the City of Northglenn's executive sessions are not taped. The reason they're not taped is because the City of Northglenn's executive sessions are governed by its charter and not by state law. NURA, by contrast, is governed by state law, and therefore its executive sessions are taped. Now, the only reason executive sessions are taped under state law, and they're only held for 90 days, is for someone to take action in a district court to confirm that a matter that was held in executive session was appropriate for executive session. So even executive session tapes can only be listened to, for example, from NURA, by a court, by a judge. But nonetheless, Northglenn's executive session provisions in its charter control, because the idea is that this is a matter of local concern in terms of how the Northglenn City Council conducts its meetings. However, several years ago, the city adopted a resolution to act more like state law in actually requiring a motion to go into executive session. Previously, and certainly not required by the charter, but not inconsistent with the charter, the city said, look, by resolution, we want to identify the matters that we're going into executive session for. And the matters under the charter that the city can go into executive session for are actually different than state law. They overlap, but they are not identical. And again, by way of example, on the bottom of page 2 of my memo, the city council can deliberate in executive session on a matter that adheres in a quasi-judicial capacity. There is no similar provision in state law. So that is something that the charter grants to you as the city council that is not in state law. But as with state law, no formal action can ever be taken in executive session. And so information that is received in executive session is what is subject to what's known as the executive session privilege. So you may have heard of, for example, the attorney-client privilege, the physician-patient privilege, the spousal privilege. Those are all privileges that are held by someone, and it is up to that someone to waive the privilege. As it relates to the attorney-client privilege, as it relates to the executive session privilege, only the client can waive the attorney-client privilege. The attorney has no power to do so. And only the city, through the council, can waive the executive session privilege, because the privilege is for the benefit of the city council. Why are executive sessions even authorized? The idea is that even cities have to do some things that it's in the best interests of the city to do in private. The presumption is that things are done in public. But for example, if someone sues the city, you are entitled, just like an individual, to get advice from your lawyer and not have the public know what that advice is. Similarly, if you're negotiating for a piece of property, and it would put you at a competitive disadvantage if you had to advise your negotiator in public what your price was. And so, much like individuals, again, for the benefit ultimately of the constituents, the city is entitled to go into executive session for certain types of matters. The city charter is silent on the definition of the word meeting. However, the open meetings law is very expansive in its definition of the term meetings. And so, under state law, a meeting must be convened to discuss or undertake a rule, regulation, ordinance, or formal action. A meeting also includes meetings in person, electronically, or otherwise. What does that mean? In the email age, I have a very simple suggestion. Never hit reply all. If you think of email as a modern day equivalent to a telephone, 3 people involved in a communication makes a meeting. So if Marcy calls Antonio on the telephone, that's not a meeting because there's only 2. If Marcy emails Antonio, that's not a meeting because there's only 2. If the city manager sends out a communication to the entire council informationally, one way, it's not a meeting. The minute someone replies to all, you've created a meeting because you now have a back and forth, a communication back and forth. And what's the danger? The danger is you are doing business in a manner that is not open to the public. So each of you individually can talk to one another. But the minute there is 3 on a communication and it's back and forth, my advice to you is that that becomes a meeting. And it's a meeting that is not open to the public and therefore not subject to the open meetings law. And that's a problem. Someone can make an open records request seeking all council emails. And therefore, my advice is never hit reply all. because by doing so, again, it becomes a meeting, and if you have more than two. It is akin to a conference call if you're hitting reply to all. We could not, for example, convene a meeting by telephone and not tell the public and have a conference call. So it's the same idea with electronic communication. And I will be the first to admit that my suggested rule is very conservative. But I think it is far better to have a bright line rule that is somehow a meeting if there is a back and forth with three or more of you, than to have an open records request and discover the hard way that there's been communications that are not open to the public that are between three or more of you. But when I say three or more, that's 3 council members. So if Jim emails 2 of you and you hit reply to all, that's okay. Again, it is 3 council members, including the mayor, that makes for a meeting.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
One of the things that kind of, well, I always had the 3, can't have more than 3 or it's a meeting, right? If you have, and maybe Joe just didn't want to take me out to dinner, but if you have like 3 council people that are getting together for a gathering, a meeting or anything, can we do that without, we can do that. How do we?
So if it is purely a social occasion, it is not covered by the open meetings law.
Okay.
My advice is always going to be, again, to be cautious. And so if there is a possibility you will be discussing public business, it is always better to post a notice that 3 or more council members may be at a given location discussing public business. There's no downside to that.
Right.
But if you're going, for example, to something that is purely social, to a party, there is no requirement to notice that.
Okay. And if you're like going somewhere, okay, I'm sorry, but if you're going somewhere and you are doing the notification, right? Does the public then have the ability, the right to come wherever I am? Like if I decide that we're going to dinner at the Lone Star or something, so then by posting that, the public can come have dinner with me?
Well, I wouldn't, again, if it's purely a social function, there's no need to notice it. But if you were, for example, having a meeting with the Adams County Commissioners at Lone Star, or you were having a council get-together at Lone Star and we're going to talk about public business, then yes, the idea is that the public, that is a meeting and council, and that the public is entitled to attend. Yep.
How do we organize those particular events? Do we let Joanna know? Do we let you know?
Joanna. So, and I assume the city manager and the city clerk work together on that, but ultimately Joanna posts the notices, and there's a couple of places under the Colorado open meetings law, the first meeting of every year. So you'll see something, I assume, on your consent agenda, the first meeting in January, that identifies the posting places for public notices. Every government in the state of Colorado does that their first meeting. That's where it'll be posted.
Okay, and then a follow-up, how does that work with CML or other conferences that there may be more than 3 of us attending at the same time?
You can do a general notice that says the council is going to be up at in Breckenridge from June 19th to 23rd. Some cities do it, some don't. You can do it either way because, again, someone could theoretically come in and kind of try to participate. But that one is a little unyieldy, admittedly. So you as the council act in primarily 2 capacities, but I will expand it to 3 capacities. The 3 capacities are legislative, quasi-judicial, and what I'll call administrative. Legislative is when you are acting on matters that are permanent in nature. So when you are adopting codified ordinances, for example, when the city adopted its marijuana regulations, those are ordinances of general application that apply citywide. That is legislative. Typically, any ordinance that is going to be codified, in other words, put into the municipal code, is a matter that is legislative. Why is that important? It's important because if you're acting in your legislative capacity, you can talk to anyone, anytime, in any venue about it. So if a matter is set, changing your marijuana regulations, for example, and it's set for first reading, and someone looks at the agenda and they call you up and they say, I want to talk to you about this, you can talk to them anytime. They can lobby you. It is legislative in nature, and so it applies citywide. By contrast, if you are acting in your quasi-judicial capacity, so for example, instead of general marijuana regulations, you are actually looking at approving or denying an application for a marijuana license. That's quasi-judicial in nature. If you are acting in your quasi-judicial capacity, the rules are much different, and you are acting as judges. What that means is you have to act as if you were a judge in every respect. So the rules are, you can't have ex parte contacts. In smaller towns, the post office is the center of the universe. And so in many small towns, decision makers get accosted in the post office about that application that they know the board's hearing at the next meeting. And you have to try to walk away, because the idea is that the decision in a quasi-judicial capacity is gavel to gavel. When the mayor drops her gavel and opens the public hearing until she drops it again to close it, the record of what you all decide in a quasi-judicial capacity is gavel to gavel. If someone talks to you outside of the meeting context, outside of the hearing context, not only do the other 8 of you not know about that conversation, nor does the applicant. So whoever, it is something that is not part of the record that you would have knowledge about. Similarly, when you're acting in your quasi-judicial capacity, you can't prejudge. What does that mean? The example that is probably most prevalent in the state of Colorado would be an application for Walmart, where oftentimes you will see cities say, I will never vote for a Walmart under any circumstances. If that happens from a decision maker acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, they violated one of the tenets of prejudgment and could theoretically get a decision invalidated because they didn't come in with an open mind and listen to the evidence and apply the evidence they heard to the rules. Yes?
In relation to that, any statements made prior to that person becoming elected, are those held against that particular official?
They are not. It's a good question, but it is one of those areas where if you can identify as you're deliberating what you're relying on in terms of the types of evidence, then you're fine. If someone says, I ran on a no Walmart, and I'm going to say no Walmart, and I can't vote under any circumstances, you violated the prejudgment rules. Northglenn, perhaps fortuitously, has actually made within the past several years some of the best law on quasi-judicial process, because Northglenn had a quasi-judicial hearing on a marijuana case that went all the way up to the Colorado Supreme Court. And that decision now is the basis for what a lot of lawyers rely on in saying this is how the quasi-judicial process works. Because what the court did is it pointed out evidence that the council had heard that in its final decision the council relied on. And the court said the council has a right to judge the credibility of the witnesses, and so they can view the evidence, and the court's not going to look at the evidence differently as long as there were no errors made. Errors of law, errors of prejudgment, errors of ex parte contact. So your decisions are given a great deal of deference when you're acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, as long as there's nothing improper included within the decision making. So you will see your staff being fairly vigilant in trying to create a record when you're acting in a quasi-judicial capacity and trying to keep to that record. Now, Northglenn's still a small town, at least in my mind. So I would suggest to you that it is sometimes unavoidable to have the contact and just say, you need to come to the meeting, because people will keep talking. There is a way to cure an improper ex parte contact. Because remember, the danger is you have information that no one else knows and that you can't respond to. So if something happens where you're acting in a quasi-judicial capacity and someone makes contact with you that you can't undo, you disclose it. You disclose it in the public record, and you say, this person approached me, I told them they needed to come to the public hearing, they said X. And you have cured the ill, if you will, of an ex parte contact, because now not only do the remainder of the council members know, but the applicant knows and any other witnesses know what you heard outside of the public hearing context. It is rare, but it happens. And so you should be aware of that. And then the other thing to avoid when you're acting in your quasi-judicial capacity is a conflict of interest. And Northglenn's charter is actually very specific in terms of what is a conflict of interest. And I would encourage you to look at what the conflict of interest provision is in the charter, because it is limited to a personal or financial interest. And what makes Northglenn, and it's in section 4.7 of the charter, and it says, no member of the council shall vote on any question in which he has a substantial personal or financial interest other than the common public interest, or on any question concerning his own conduct, and in said instances the member shall disclose this interest to the council. What is unique about Northglenn's charter is it adds a second provision that says, on all other questions, each member who is present shall vote when his name is called. What that means is, unless you have a substantial personal or financial interest, under Northglenn's charter, you are required to vote. So if it is a difficult question that you feel as if you can't make a decision and would like to abstain, Northglenn's charter says you can't do that. And that is, again, a fairly unusual provision. But absent a substantial personal or financial interest, you are required to vote on every matter that comes before you as a member of the Northglenn City Council. But if you do have a conflict of interest, then you are required to disclose it and not vote. When you are acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, your decision is appealable straight to the Adams County District Court. The Adams County District Court's job is not to determine whether you were right or wrong. Its job is not to determine whether you weighed the evidence correctly. You are entitled to weigh the evidence as you see fit, so long as you make no errors of law and don't violate any of the rules we talked about. So again, no conflict of interest, no prejudgment, no ex parte contacts. I will do my best to advise you on the law so you make no errors of law. And if you follow those, your decisions will be affirmed every time. In terms of I'm not going to go into any more detail on the conflict of interest ethics provisions because they are fairly substantial in your code. But the language in the charter is really what matters to the City Council when you're voting on matters in front of you. But I do want to spend some time on the form of government, because it really does inform how you communicate in terms of getting things done. So section 3.110 of the city charter withholds powers from the council. And what it says is the council shall deal with the administrative service solely and directly through the city manager, and neither the council, its members, nor committees shall either dictate the appointment or direct or interfere with the work of any officer or employee under the city manager. What that means is, if you don't think your road is being plowed appropriately, you don't go out to the snowplow driver and say, plow my road better. You work through the city manager and say, I think there's issues with snow plowing. And your job as council members is not to give direction. Your job is to make policy. And to the extent that there is a a concern with something that involves the administrative functions of the city, how the city is operating on a day-to-day basis, our charter says you work through the city manager and the city manager's staff. So that doesn't mean you can't raise concerns about the administrative services of the city. What it does mean is that you can't give direction to employees of the city other than your employees. And your employees are the city manager, the city clerk, the judge, and the city attorney. Those are your employees. Those are your appointees. And as it relates to the administrative service, you work through the city manager. At the same time, it has to be read consistently with Section 1.4 of the Charter. And again, that ultimately says you have the power. The power to govern is vested in the City Council. And so you're the one that adopts policies. You're the one that makes the legislation, gives the direction that then the city manager, through his staff, implements on a day-to-day basis. How does that mean kind of on a day-to-day basis? I would suggest to you it is the city manager's job, through his staff, to make sure you have all of the information to make good decisions on everything. So the goal here is never to be a barrier to getting information. The form of government is not intended in any manner to be a barrier to getting information. In fact, it's just the opposite. The goal is to get you as much information on any particular issue as you all need to make good decisions. So there's no limitation on questions. The limitation is only on giving direction to employees of the city, because the direction comes through the city manager. There are, I thought, and I think Jim will probably talk a little bit about communication, but in talking to Jim, one of the things, different city managers have different mechanisms in terms of how they want you to communicate with staff. And I think, and Jim will correct me if I'm wrong, but his general policy is he doesn't ever want to be an impediment to you seeking information from his department heads. He just wants to know about it. And so I think he doesn't have a concern with you going directly to a department head. Some city managers in some cities do. It's incumbent on his department directors and incumbent on you all to sort of make sure that he's in the loop, because if you're getting information about something and he doesn't know about it, it's hard for him to manage your needs and get you what you need. So it's just a matter of figuring out what that kind of communication sweet spot is so that you're getting the information you need and he can implement your policies. And so that is something that over time, I think you figure out what that sweet spot is. But I know that Jim doesn't have any concerns with you just going and getting answers, getting information on questions you have. There have been some, the last thing I wanted to do was try to gear this to some of the questions I've heard in the first month, give or take, that have been raised. And I know, for example, at the last meeting, there was a question raised about bidding. Bidding is a good example of having provisions in our charter that talk about having competitive bidding, and then we have an entire chapter in our municipal code about how that process works. And so over time, the bidding process that has been adopted legislatively by ordinance has been revised. So for example, when this thing was written, I don't think anyone knew what a design-build contract was. So more recently, there have been bidding requirements about how to bid design-bid contracts that would have never been contemplated in 1975. Several years ago, Northglenn decided to have a local preference provision added to its bidding. So that's in the ordinance. And so that's a good example of the charter providing a framework of you got to have competitive bidding on amounts that the council determines by ordinance, and then the details are in the municipal code, which can be amended from time to time. And then when you talk about matters of local concern and matters of statewide concern, one matter that is always a matter of statewide concern is Tabor. And there's really no good way to identify in a couple of paragraphs what Tabor means, but in a very general sense, increases in taxes have to be approved by the voters. Increase in debt by the government has to be approved by voters. Now, I say that very carefully because governments are also authorized to do what are called revenue bonds if they have an enterprise, which is a business within the government, without voter approval. And so some governments, for example, will operate their water or their sewer or both as an enterprise. And if they operate as an enterprise, you do not need voter approval because the idea is that governmental entities are not precluded from operating a component of their operation as a true business and therefore not a government operation. But at the end of the day, Tabor is probably a week-long conference, but in a general sense, the idea is that debt and taxes have to be approved by the voters. Again, this is intended to be a very, very broad overview. Questions will come up. My number's on the front. You can always reach me by phone or email, and I'm happy to answer any questions or move on to Joanna. Move on to Joanna.
Oh. I'm like, what? You want to answer questions about Joanna? I'm sorry. I need to turn my ears.
Cool. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So I have put a notebook in front of each member, and it includes several different items. So I'll go through most of it, not all of it. Corey covered a lot of the items during his remarks, so I'll try not to duplicate a lot of information. But we've added some information, so I'd like to touch on that. Obviously, the meetings and meeting procedures, in case any of the new council members have questions about that. So if you open the notebook, the first thing you'll see is a 2018 meeting calendar. This is subject to change, especially because as we get further along in the year, we'll have holidays, and the charter requires that the council meets at least twice in regular session. So we'll need to call a couple special meetings to comply with the charter provisions there. But this kind of gives you a snapshot of what you've agreed to for the coming year. We obviously know that people have conflicts during the year, which is no big deal. All you need to do if you can't make a meeting is just let the city manager or myself know, or the mayor. We'll communicate with each other. And that just helps us to know if we're going to have a quorum for that meeting. So not being nosy, just want to make sure that we can go ahead and have that meeting for the rest of the council. And then I forgot to mention prior to Corey speaking that his memo is included in there, so I apologize for that. But a copy of his memo is provided in case you want to mark that up. And then next you'll see on the lime green cover the actual council handbook. So in the beginning of this, it touches a little bit on the community history, in case you're not familiar with how Northglenn became Northglenn. We basically went from two words to one. And so then it also gives a quick snapshot of the city services, a little bit of city data there, some community profile information, and then a list of the different city facilities that you'll be touring at a later date. It also includes some information that's generally found in the budget documents, and that's the strategic statements, goals, business principles, and those items. Corey covered the form of government, which is located at the top of page 5. I also provide a list of the municipal code and the different chapters there. There's an electronic version of the municipal code online, but there's always a current copy in the city clerk's office. And I believe there's one in the council mailroom too if you want to flip through that document. So then if we move on a little further, at the bottom of page 6, it talks about the city council protocol and operating guidelines. The city council adopted protocol back in, I believe it was 2008, and then it was revised in 2014. So we currently have 7 council protocol that you might hear staff refer to. These really talk about assigning projects to staff, interacting with staff, interacting with each other, with council, and sharing information with council. These are, I want to just point out that these are in addition to any of the rules or provisions that are provided for by the charter and the municipal code. So these are kind of in addition to, even though they're called protocol and they seem kind of significant, they are, but there are other rules that also apply. So then on page 8, we go into the boards and commissions. The city has 10 different boards and commissions. So there's a summary of each and when they meet and which department provides the staff support to the board, in case that's helpful for council. Many of you have been appointed as ex officio members to some of the boards, so you'll become more familiar with their function and how they work. But if you ever have any questions, feel free to give the staff liaison a shout or contact the city clerk's office and we can help you with that as well. There's information about the different council committees. So you'll see information on the Finance Committee, the Legislative Policy Committee, the Outside Agency Funding Committee, and the Performance Appraisal Committee. These are all committees that should be noticed. Corey touched on the open meetings law and the need to notice meetings when there are 3 or more members of the council there. The easiest thing to do is just give the city clerk's office a call, let us know. If it seems like a more of a social nature, we can help make that determination, but we'd rather have the information and just go ahead and post a quick, simple notice rather than not have a notice posted for an actual meeting that's occurring. And one thing at the end of that information, it goes into the different council liaisons, but the very last paragraph in that section is council employee evaluations. I sometimes worry that new council members might be surprised at near the end of the year when you discover that you have to perform evaluations on the council appointed employees, which are the city manager, city clerk, city attorney, and municipal judge. So that is a part of your duties. The Performance Appraisal Committee kind of coordinates that function and kickstarts that, but then in the end, the entire council does participate in that. You'll find an organization chart on page 14 that gives a nice look at how the different departments are organized for the city. And then we go into giving a brief summary of each department and their services. And then there's contact information for the department head. The information here is very brief. There is more information behind what I'll call the yellow tab near the back of the book. If you flip there, you'll see a bunch of smiling faces looking back at you, and that's a page that shows the staff leadership team. Sometimes I know that it's kind of hard to become familiar with a lot of people all at one time, so this will hopefully help you become familiar with who we are. And then behind that page, there are department summaries. And these documents are new this year. They provide a good picture of the different divisions within a department, the responsibilities, goals, and then how we anticipate interacting with council. So those are nice back there. Those look great.
Yes, it looks really good.
Can't take credit for that. Whoever did those, very useful.
Very much so.
Alrighty, so I'm going to skip to page 18, and that's where we start talking about the meetings and meeting procedures. The first item there is the Open Meetings Act, and as you heard the city attorney cover that earlier, the only thing that I would mention twice now is that if there is the possibility that 3 or more council members will attend a function to talk about city business, just let us know. It makes it super easy.
it's what we're there to do. I've heard people say, oh, I don't want to bother staff, or we don't want to, have more than 3 attend because we don't want to post a notice. Just let us know. It's a matter of minutes to get that notice posted so that you can meet. There's also a little section on ward meetings. I've heard that some council members already have ward meetings scheduled, which is awesome. But if you are thinking about doing that, the ward council members work together to set the agenda and to find a date in order to do that. But the executive assistant to the city manager is super helpful when you need to reserve a room for the meeting or get a microphone, different logistical issues. So please include her in that loop, and she'll make sure that the council has what they need for the meeting. One new section that we added is called the general meeting procedures. And these are just a list of items that we thought might help meetings run efficiently. As someone who gets to attend most of the council meetings and watch how council performs, I think we're really fortunate that we work well together, or that the council works well together. But this was just put in as a quick reminder. And so I'll just go through them really quick. So the first one is obtaining the floor. A member of the city council or staff shall first address the mayor and gain recognition, and then wait for the mayor to call on the different members and then speak once you're recognized. Number 2 is questions to staff. Any council member may, after recognition by the mayor, address questions to the designated staff member. Talks about interruptions, about letting that council member who's been recognized have the floor and not interrupting. Discussion limit. This is followed at times. Our council isn't super formal, but I've seen this work well for the council here, and that's, if you have comments to make, wait until you're recognized by the mayor, make your comments, and then wait until every other member has an opportunity to make their comments before speaking twice. It's kind of just a wait your turn type of thing. And then it also talks about if a council member desires to table a matter, that they should make a motion to table the item, and then how they would vote on that. And then it also speaks about how a council member is not required to state your reason for a dissenting vote, but oftentimes members will go ahead and make those statements just for purposes of discussion and to encourage open discussion on the different matters. You'll also see the code of conduct listed there. Those 9 items under the code of conduct were actually adopted by the council back in 2008. They have not been revised since, so we still refer to those. Then we move down into the different types of meetings. The city council has 3 different types of meetings. We've got our regular meetings. That's where the majority of the business is conducted. Study sessions are held, and those sometimes are referred to as work sessions. Those are intended to have less formal discussion, open discussion among council and the staff to kind of explore different items. And then special meetings. And special meetings are just that, they're special. They're called special. You'll notice that I give a special notice once in a while in my email, which is a charter requirement. And they're special because the council is only allowed to act on the items that are noticed on that special meeting agenda. So you really have to stick to the script on those meetings. And then I mentioned a little bit about executive sessions. The city attorney covered that in detail. So my only note there is if you as council ever believe that you need to call an executive session on a matter, consult the city attorney, and he'll walk you through that and make sure that we're citing the appropriate section from this city charter. So then agendas and packets. Feels like it's kind of out of order to talk about this since we've already had meetings and you have already seen the packets. But in case you have any questions, I'd like to go through that just briefly. You'll notice that staff will send out an email, I will, or staff, that notifies council that the agenda and packet for a certain meeting are available for council's review online. There's generally a link to what we call web docs in the email. When you hear us say web docs, we're talking about the part of the website that's dedicated to meeting documents. which is a super cool internal program that IT created for us, where you can find agendas, packets, audio recordings, videos, voting results for any meeting that we have. So those items are put out on Wednesday afternoons for council's review. And then they're released to the public on Friday. And that period from Wednesday afternoon to Friday afternoon was originally decided on to give council an opportunity to look at the different items, ask questions of staff if you had questions about anything, or if you saw information that needed to be corrected or that you wanted to be changed. That was then a period of time for those items to happen before the information was released to the public on that Friday. Changes can still happen after the agenda and packet are released to the public. It's just a different process because we'll mark things to be revised so that people who have accessed that information can follow the timeline on that. So that's what that Wednesday to Friday kind of time frame is for. And you'll notice on Wednesdays you'll need to put in your username and password to access all of the items. Once the information is released to the public, you'll notice that a few things might still remain private. That would be anything that's privileged, like a legal memorandum from the city attorney. Once we move into marijuana licensing, you'll notice that applications with sensitive information or confidential information will also remain private. So you will have to still enter your username and password at times to access those. And please let us know if you haven't been successful with using your username or password to access WebDocs currently. So then attendance at council meetings, pretty simple statement. Attendance is expected. And then once again, if you can't attend a meeting, just let us know so that we can determine if a quorum will be present. There's a new section in here regarding motions. A motion is basically initiating action on a proposal. There's a very simple procedure for motions that's been included here. Motions and Robert's Rules of Order can get pretty tricky. Definitely not a Robert's Rules expert by any means. Luckily, we have a parliamentarian on City Council. But this is just intended to give a quick snapshot of your simple, main motion. A motion needs a second. If it doesn't receive a second, it dies. And then how the vote happens after that. And you guys have made motions and voted already, so if there are any questions about that, just let us know. The city attorney already covered how voting is required by the council members. There's a very brief section on meeting minutes. Our minutes might be different than other municipalities that you've seen. We use what we call action minutes, so they're brief. They record the action that is taken, but when it comes to discussion items or discussion during a motion, like a motion for a resolution or ordinance, you will notice that there is very little or no text provided in the minutes for those items. It's really just to document the action that was taken. We don't do verbatim minutes. We definitely we don't want to get into the details of what certain people say during the meetings. So they're action minutes. So if there's something that you're not seeing in there may be a reason that we don't consider that to be part of the action minutes. But if you do believe that we have missed something or that there is something that's incorrect, please feel free to contact me and we can get those meetings amended, or those minutes amended. We'll talk a little bit about public participation, but I'll address that in a second as well. So on page 22, there is an order of what you will see on the agenda for a regular city council meeting. And that just gives you an idea of how the meeting will flow. That 20-item list is if we had every type of item on an agenda. So there will be meetings where you don't see many of those items. But if we had all of the items, that would be the order that we would follow. And then after that, we address all of the different sections of the agenda and try to provide a little summary of what each of those are. I just wanted to touch on a couple of those, just in order for the new members to know what opportunities they have during the meetings. The first one is the agenda additions and deletions. This isn't used a whole lot, but council members do have the opportunity to ask for items to be added to or deleted from the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. Just want to point out that any items added to the agenda are for discussion only, unless the item is considered to be urgent. So if you have an item that you believe is an emergency and you want council to take action on that night and you intend to add it to the agenda, I would just ask you to consult the city attorney about that so that we can determine whether or not it is a true emergency. Otherwise, you can still add the item, but it will just be for discussion purposes only. So then we also talk about interviews for boards and commission members, proclamations, public invited to be heard. The council has 2 opportunities for public invited to be heard. I'm sure you're well aware of one at the beginning of the meeting, one at the end. We actually have a policy on public comment, and that is included in the book, and I'll show you where that is a little bit later. The other item is items removed from consent agenda. It's also one of the sections that isn't used very often, but if the council sees an item on the consent agenda that you would like to discuss or that you have a question about, it is super easy to just ask the mayor, tell the mayor that you would like that item removed from the consent agenda. It's actually just moved down to the next item. It's voted on separately, super easy. Talk a little bit about public hearings. The city attorney provided some great information about the differences between legislative hearings and quasi-judicial hearings, so I won't go into that. There's information about ordinances and resolutions. Section 4.6 of the city charter states that the council shall only act by ordinance, resolution, or motion. So we give a little information about ordinances and the procedure for adopting ordinances there. The item at the very bottom is marijuana licensing. Also don't want anybody to be surprised that that is one of your functions as a council member now. We have what's called a marijuana licensing authority, and at this time the city council serves as that authority. So eventually applications for marijuana business licenses, whether that be a new application or a renewal application that isn't able to be approved administratively, will be brought to the council to be acted on in that capacity. And those meetings are held during regular city council meetings. So what happens is the mayor just adjourns the regular city council meeting to a meeting of the marijuana licensing authority. We take care of that business, and then we reconvene the regular meeting. So it's not a separate meeting, sort of. All right, and then goes into talk about communications, which you have experienced and are all great at. The proposed agenda list, that is a list that we keep by date of all of the items that will be coming forward to council. I haven't shared that or distributed it to council in several weeks, but usually I send that out every 2 or 3 weeks just to give council an idea of what's on the schedule. And that way, if there's anything that you would like added to the list, at that time you can just shoot me a quick email and we'll get it added to the appropriate meeting. At the bottom of page 25, there's a very short list of do's and don'ts for meetings. In looking at some best practices for effective meetings, I just thought this was a very quick list, borrowed from another city, of some do's and don'ts. There's one on there that I wasn't really aware of until I had a question from a member of the public, and it was regarding city council using mobile devices during a meeting. You know, as council or staff, we don't really think much of it because we know that people multitask or use a device to look things up because Google is our best friend. But to a member of the public, sometimes the perception to them is that you may be communicating with another member of the council on the dais electronically, and that the discussion might be happening privately instead of publicly. It may not be the case, but I just wanted to point out that sometimes people do have a perception that something different is happening. So to just keep that in the back of your mind. And the same with side conversations. With the microphones, they may not be very much of a side conversation. They may be picked up to be a full-blown conversation. So that's also something to keep in mind too. All right, so page 26. That talks about the just some general council information and business procedures. I mentioned the executive assistant to the city manager a little bit ago. I wanted to say her name is Susan Baca, just because I will flip back and forth between title and then referring to her as Susan, so I want council to know who I'm referring to. This gives some different types of information, but to sum it up, Susan is the best person to contact if council needs help with conference registrations, travel arrangements for conferences, purchasing, reimbursements for different items, and then once again scheduling those ward meetings. Something new that's happened in the last year, maybe, or year and a half, is that individual members of the council do not receive a purchasing card. So because of that, you may need to utilize Susan more often. The mayor receives a purchasing card, and it talks about the different types of expenditures that can be made with that card in there. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the council is limited from registering for trainings or conferences or traveling. There's just a different process to do that, and Susan is the best person who can help you accomplish that. So then, on page 28, it also talks about advances in mileage reimbursement if you need help with that. Gives a list of the organizations the city is a member of, and then also talks a little bit more about training opportunities. And I noticed that we say in there to contact the executive assistant to the city manager if you are not receiving these communications. It's probably a little difficult to know what you're not receiving, so I apologize for that. If you're not receiving many communications, the most important one in my mind is communications from CML. They're a great organization who have trainings for elected officials. Obviously, their annual conference is a big event for elected officials. So CML definitely, NLC, the National League of Cities, Dr. Cog has trainings throughout the year as well for elected officials. So if you're not receiving emails from them or publications, just let myself or Susan know, and we'll make sure that you get on those lists. I mentioned the three annual conferences down there that different council members have attended in the past. I do have some dates if you want to pencil those in. The National League of Cities, the annual Congressional Cities Conference in March, that will be held March 11th through 14th, 2018 in Washington, D.C. And then the CML annual conference in June, that will be June 19th through 22nd, and that will be held in Vail this year.
I'm sorry, you want to give that last one again, please?
June 19th through 22nd. And it's a great conference. Luckily, we have a great link to the CML Executive Board with Mayor Dodge serving as the president. But if you're curious about that conference at all, just ask a fellow council member. Or I'm sure I have, the programs from conferences past that show the different types of sessions that they offer. It's a wide variety. It's a really great conference. Sessions are short, so you can really pack in a lot during those few days. Then on page 29, it talks about how the city will handle mail for council, phone calls from residents for council. A lot of residents are not aware that council doesn't have their own offices in City Hall, but we will take those inquiries and make sure that they get to council as best that we can. Most of the time when residents call and want to be put through to your office or your voicemail, we'll let them know that those don't exist, that council does not have a separate office here in City Hall. We will give them your contact information. So if you prefer to be contacted on your cell phone, please let us know. And that's what we will make sure that those residents then utilize. So on page 30, it talks a little bit about council email. The city attorney touched on email, so the only thing that I would like to give a quick reminder about is to just be mindful that email is subject to the Open Records Act, and also to refrain from conducting those electronic meetings if possible. Page 31 talks about different ways to stay informed. A lot of these are city communications. There's a council calendar, an events calendar, the city manager's weekly reports that I'm sure Jim will talk about in a little bit, that provides a nice calendar of upcoming events. The Northglenn e-News, which is a program that residents or the public, anybody can go sign up for on the website. And the goal of that is to provide more detailed information than the social media posts provide about events that are coming up. And then other newsletters and publications, and these are from, CML. They send out a newsletter electronically. They also send out this nice Colorado Municipalities magazine that I think I just got this last week, or maybe it's been sitting on my desk. But I brought this with me. These are really, I love this publication. And in this case, there's one on quasi-judicial and ex parte issues, which I marked up because it's great. And I wish Corey was here so he could tell me if he doesn't like it. But it's actually written in a conversational style, a conversation between, in this case, a commission member and then their city attorney. But I thought it was a great example to explain the differences between the quasi-judicial hearings and then legislative hearings, what to do about ex parte communication, because sometimes it's not possible to avoid those conversations because you can't unhear something before you have a chance to say, oh, wait a minute, we can't have this conversation. So shout out to CML for this publication. If you're not receiving it, let us know and we'll find out how we can get this sent to you. It's super helpful. All right, then page 32. I will not read these terms, but there is a glossary of terms for everybody. And then after that, there are some commonly used acronyms, which will hopefully be helpful. Staff at times loves to use acronyms, and it can get a little overwhelming. Sometimes I'm lost, so we might add to this throughout the year. But there are those in case those will help you. After the gray tab, we have included copies of different policies. So you'll see the council policies, the travel policy, there's the comprehensive financial policy document, the purchasing policy. That may be helpful with some questions that I've heard recently about bids or RFPs for different projects. Take a look at that. It kind of explains the different criteria for the different projects and what staff is required to do. We've also included a copy of a little section of the municipal code, which is the city's code of ethics. And then that one-pager, which is the policy on public comment at city council meetings. So that explains why we limit those different sections of the agenda. And then something new that we've included this year is a copy of the Ethics, Liability, and Best Practices Handbook for Elected Officials. This is a publication that CIRSA and CML have provided. It's a great publication. So if you have a chance, skim through that. I'm sorry.
Dang.
I know. Sorry about that. In addition to that,
You can check it out and take it home and watch it in the bedroom.
Yeah, so what we'll do, there's a public officials training video that CIRSA asks that all elected officials watch. So I will give a copy of these to the newly elected council members, and if any of the current returning city council members would like to watch it again, we can make that happen. Oh, that's so. It's only 17 minutes long. It's not that bad. You'll survive it. It's actually better than it was. So yes, I do have these for. It's improved.
It sounds like a popcorn night.
But the handbook from CIRSA and CML, they talk about liability, which is always good to know about. They go into practices of ineffective councils and boards, ethical conduct, elected officials' involvement in personnel matters, and executive sessions. It's written pretty well. It's pretty short, so it's not painful at all. And one of the authors is Tammy Tenoy, and so she actually injects some humor in her writing, which I appreciate. And so I have taken the liberty of sticking 2 short articles that she has written in that green tab right behind that handbook. So read them at your leisure if you would like. The first one is about working productively as a council. I thought it was interesting because she approaches it kind of like a marriage. Her conclusion, which cracked me up, was until next election, do you part? But in addition to being a little humorous, it has some great information that whether you're going to use it for your role on council or for your interactions with adult humans every day, I thought it had some great information there. And then the second article is interesting because she provides some examples that deal with the differences between council's actions and their intentions. Also good, even if you use it for something else. So there are those in there. She's actually come out and done a training for our boards and commissions previously, and it was very well received. So I always like to include her information when possible. So behind that green tab, you will find copies of the city manager's presentation that he will be providing, and then the 2018 and 2017 work plans. So I'm going to skip over those. And we already touched on the leadership team and the departmental summaries. So behind that last tab, it's kind of a work in progress at the very back of the notebook. Like I mentioned earlier, the City Council will serve as the marijuana licensing authority. And so my goal is to provide maybe even a separate, smaller handbook for your role on the authority, to kind of provide some plain language information about the different applications that you may see and what you will be required to act on. But to give a very general snapshot, I included 2 maps. And the first one can be a little overwhelming, although I really like it because it shows our current marijuana businesses. And these are locations that have been approved, not necessarily operating. So you'll see 6 locations that are marked on the map, only 5 are operating. But it also provides the different constraints in the different colors, so you can get a picture of where the residential property is, where schools are, where city-owned property, parks are located, and the general vicinity, and you can see that the city is not oversaturated with marijuana businesses and how they lay out across the area. And then on the next map, that is the same picture without the individual constraints, and it just shows the remaining available area for a potential marijuana license to be issued. So you can see it's very limited. And so the distance requirements that the council adopted several months ago actually limit the total number of marijuana licenses that will be allowed in the city. So until you're asked to act on an application for a marijuana licensed business, I wanted to give the council and the authority just a snapshot. In case you're approached by residents or businesses, you'll have a general understanding of the number of businesses that we currently have. And then you'll know that the remaining available areas are very limited right now. When council, if council asks us, how many marijuana licenses do we have, staff may hesitate, and the only reason for that is generally there are more than one license issued to a marijuana business. So it's possible if they do medical marijuana and retail marijuana and cultivate on site, there could be several licenses. So instead we talk about our marijuana businesses. So currently we have 6 marijuana businesses, 5 are operating. And then, because we don't have council meetings for a few weeks because of the holidays, I think Corey suggested that you all read the city charter, but that's a tiny little book. So if you get done with that, I've included copies of the municipal code regarding the medical marijuana and retail marijuana. But if you'd rather not do that and just wait for the different information before you act on a marijuana application, you can do that as well. So in addition, CML was kind enough to send some notebooks for the newly elected council members. Mayor Dodge actually issued the letter that is inside the book, but it has some great information just about CML and what they provide as an organization, their different publications. And that's one thing, if there's a publication from CML that you're interested in, it's very possible that we have a copy upstairs in the city clerk's office. They have publications on a variety of topics. Tabor is one of them. So if you are interested, check with us first if you want. We can loan that out to you, or we can help you purchase a copy for yourself as well. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about the material that I went over.
I think you did a great job. That's my only question. I think it's beautiful. It's extensive compared to, I believe, what we got 2 years ago.
It's grown a bit.
Yeah, it's quite extensive, and I think that you did a really good job on it. And I know that the new members will really appreciate it.
Yeah, actually, go ahead. Thank you for putting this together. This is beyond fantastic. So thank you. One thing I'm really trying to get my head around, and I'll sneak in and do my rating later on, but is how do we move something forward, right? So I notice we can say that we want to talk about it and we can have a discussion, but what happens next? Does everything always have to go through a study session? Do we, how do we pass something? So say I want to have purple toilet paper in every single municipal building. How do I pass that?
You'll probably get different answers from me or from the city manager, and the only reason I say that is because I think my focus would be, okay, so what meeting would you like that on? We'll go ahead and get that on the agenda, which gets it on the agenda quickly, but that may not be the best process. Because if it's something that the city manager, maybe he's aware that, well, we already looked into purple toilet paper, and but we found that pink is actually cheaper, so maybe there's a compromise, or maybe staff's already working on that. And so the city manager might have a better understanding of if there's any time considerations, if staff's already working on that, if he's already been thinking of it, maybe we can get that on sooner rather than later. So I think the best thing to do is maybe to just, to start initially asking the city manager.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment. I agree with what you said there. It's going to depend on the issue. I think sometimes if one council member is asking staff, one of your employees, if you will, to do more than, like it says, 2 hours worth of work, whether it be Corey or myself doing a ton of research on something before we can have the discussion with council, we'd probably want to have that discussion with council first to say, do you authorize as a body me or the city attorney to do all that research, or is this kind of a non-issue that no one wants to advance it, if you will? There are some other things that are relatively simple. I would say like resolutions, maybe supporting some kind of issue. I know we had a couple of those last year where we were supporting the DREAM Act. We had another one on immigration issues. And so they were put on the agenda, discussed, debated, and voted on relatively simply. I think there are some things that if they're going to cause a major impact to the work plan, the annual budget, definitely that's a study session item that the whole group might want to roll up their sleeves and kick around for a little bit. So there's no one right answer, I guess. It really depends on the issue.
So that's totally fair. So say, for example, we need consensus from council, and I put that on as an agenda item, it's discussion only. So how do are we taking a formal action by saying we want to explore this further?
One thing that I've seen different council members do is actually bring up those topics during communications in a regular council meeting, and they'll use that opportunity to let the council know that you would like to advance a certain item. And at that time, if there were concerns about whether it would take more than 2 hours of research by the attorney, that would be, I've seen it work as a good opportunity to kind of get the approval of council. It doesn't have to be formal, but council could object if they wanted to say, yeah, I don't want to spend staff time on that quite yet. But they could also say, sure, yeah, let's get that scheduled for the next study session to explore that.
Are there any further questions for Joanna? This was awesome, I have to say that also, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Joanna. It's a team effort.
I know, but thanks everyone then.
All right. Well, I've got some slides with mine, and I've got a short one-pager to hand out to you. So this is, I think, after one of the green tab there at the end, if you want to follow along in your book. This is really what I wanted to cover just very briefly. The city department overview, you've already seen the individual department sheets, so I'll skip that. Again, I wasn't going to go over those in any great detail tonight, but just good snapshots of each department, what they're working on, how they may be communicating with you, especially on boards and commissions. Going to talk briefly about some 2018 budget goals and priorities, which will include some comments that the council gave at the February 2017 retreat as priorities for the 2018 budget. Going to talk a little bit about the 2018 work plan and how that is aligned with the budget. Also want to show what you have to look forward to at the retreat. Really is getting into the 2019 work plan and budget process, and then I've got a actually draft agenda for the retreat that we can discuss tonight if you want to give me some feedback. I'm actually meeting with our potential facilitator on Thursday, so timing is perfect, hopefully. All right. So as Joanna noted in her documents there, there's city council goals and priorities. Some of these, most of these, the first 5 really came out of a 2001-2004 strategic plan retreat with the council at that point. The 6th one there, Livable Neighborhoods and Homes, was actually added as part of the 2009 comprehensive plan. So this is actually one of the topics that we discussed as a leadership team at our retreat a few weeks ago, and maybe something we want to revisit as part of your retreat. They are not overly specific to Northglenn, as you can tell. They're kind of anywhere USA, and so we might want to get more specific about what we're trying to accomplish here in the city. I wanted to show this picture, and the council that interviewed me a couple years ago, this might look familiar, but really what I'm pointing out here is that the start of the budget process or the budget cycle for 2018 actually started last February. And it came up with the council retreat at the very top there, priorities for the 2018 work plan. Then we initiated the draft work plan, started working on the budget. In the summer, we developed the budget and presented it, showed how the work plan was going to align with that. And then in the fall, the city council adopted the budget, and then we moved on with the work plan. So I've got one of these, of course, for 2019, and I'll show you here at the end what we have to look forward to at the retreat. These were the top 4 major priorities that came out of the retreat. As you see, they're largely very capital intensive, and clearly there are a bunch of other little things and big things that we've been working on throughout last year and going into next year. But I think there's probably some alignment in talking with a lot of you about these things too. The marketplace stabilization and redevelopment is a huge priority. Civic campus implementation, we made a lot of progress on that in 2017. Huron Street rehabilitation, this is not the aesthetic improvements that we just completed. This was actually full-blown reconstruction of the road. And so this was identified as a priority. We couldn't do much on this in 2017 because we were waiting for the 4 mills to pass, and thankfully the voters approved that in perpetuity and took the sunset off. So we've got some opportunities there. And then Lift Station A, force main design and construction. Again, not on its face a very maybe exciting project, but for David it is, I know. This is about a $30 million improvement. And one of the things that we did in 2017 and the council did was approve the water rates going into the 2018 budget to help fund this project. So looking forward, I like to point out what my budget philosophy is because in the charter I'm responsible for presenting a budget to you by a specified date. I believe it's the 3rd week of September. We've moved that up a few weeks, several weeks in fact, so I try to do that the 1st week of August. which then gives you an opportunity to give kind of final rounds of feedback, and then we get that adopted by the October meeting, and again done by resolution after a public hearing. But these are my philosophies when I'm looking at developing a budget for the city. I specifically did not number these, so in my mind they are all relatively equal. But as you can tell, they're also competing sometimes. Want to maintain our levels of service, for sure. That's what we provide to every resident and business in the community. Operating and maintain our capital assets and facilities, hopefully to reduce their long-term cost of ownership and to replace them when they need to be replaced. The general capital improvement program and whatever that means to council. Fortify the financial position of the organization, and I got to thank my predecessors 2-3 managers ago, frankly, for really continuing to save money, and we've got a very robust fund balance right now. And then invest in employees, and this could mean compensation. It could be offering better benefits or keeping some of the burden on the city for those benefits. It can include training, other advancement opportunities and things like that. So it's not just necessarily a pay, if you will. So the work plan that I've attached to the back there, a couple of folded pages. I'm not going to go over these in detail, but we can answer any questions, of course. The 2017 one is very simply identified as some of the highlighted areas. This is essentially the Q4 update, but it's a draft because Q4 isn't complete. So this is dated a couple of weeks ago. But really just to give you an idea of everything that we anticipated accomplishing in 2017 and a general status of where we're at. So new council members, you attended the work plan update in the middle of November. I'll have a very similar update for the annual work plan, if you will, in February. We'll be going over that in the public meeting. But each one of these, I should pause for a second, and then behind that is the 2018 work plan, which again is aligned with the budget. We got this finalized as a leadership team last week, and so it's very clear, I think, of all the different projects. I'm going to walk through some of those very briefly and let you know when you'll be seeing some of these in front of you, because we've got study sessions and actions actually scheduled already. But one of the things that we tried to do on this work plan is really that second column is target, 1 to 2 years. And what we attempted to do there was try to put in some SMART goals. So strategic, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, not every target meets those criteria, but we try to hit a lot of them. And throughout the document, you'll see there's a project schedule by quarter, who the lead department is, if there's support departments that are providing assistance, and then if we've got a funding source identified and where that's coming from and the amount. So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on each one of these, but we try to organize them into 8 program areas. A lot of these are the same as last year. I will point out there's a couple of new ones. We've pulled out the Civic Campus as its own program area. Really, there are so many moving parts with that, with the building design, the infrastructure, the public-private partnership, really became its own program area. Organizational development, I initially had embedded this into an operational initiative, but you'll see with some of the organizational development things that I've identified, it's really become its own program, and it's a multi-year ongoing effort. We'll never be, if you will, complete with that. And then the last one at the bottom, there was transportation. And we're going to be providing an update to you on a variety of projects coming up, but we have things like corridor plans, bike plans, traffic calming, RTD. I mean, it's a myriad of things that are related to transportation. It really made sense to try to put those under one umbrella program at this point. So let me just hit these up briefly, and then we'll wrap up with some retreat stuff. So these were 3 projects that were actually from the 2014 strategic plan that we're still working on finishing up. The marketing plan has been paused at this point pending the hiring of a new communications manager. So we put that part of the plan on hold, if you will. We hope to get someone on here by February, so relatively quickly. The website redesign, I would say we were trying to go live at the end of December. I identified some concerns a few weeks ago about The information that we had on the existing website was just being transferred over, and so we want to make sure we're updating that content. So that's probably more of a Q1 go live date on the website. And then branding and logo implementation is ongoing. A couple of highlights that we're trying to get done is replace the monument logos out here on the front. Doing some things with Chambers to add a logo back here. And then we're going to be looking at longer term things like apparel, shirts, street signs, things of that nature, which are really being replaced as they need to be. So we're not necessarily incurring a bunch of additional costs. The big one hanging out there, of course, is the monument signs around the interstate, and that's not an easy fix. So more to come on that in the future. Major public facilities. Again, I kind of pulled the Civic Campus out of this area here, but we're looking at Northwest Open Space construction. Right now we have the contract for that scheduled for June. The Kiwanis Outdoor Pool Bathhouse Replacement and Splash Pad Addition. We've got an update planned for you on that March 5th. And I actually gave you some concept designs, I think, in last Friday's report that Amanda provided. Justice Center construction is well underway. We're planning a fall opening for that. Thank you. Striking now, isn't it?
Yes. Striking is a very good word. It is beautiful. Thank you.
So compliments to David and the chief and their teams that have been moving that thing forward. We are very close to being, if you will, dried in. And so we're looking at maybe February to get council back out there again to see the interior before it's all complete, so you can kind of get a feel for the space out there. Ralston House, we're going to be issuing invoices to all the entities here this week. And so we do have this project fully funded through the IGA, and we're hoping to have a construction contract in front of you in February with completion by the end of 2018. Justice Center West Park, this is also affectionately known as the Berry property, which the city acquired last year, 2016. And so just some pre-planning at this point. Really, we're coming back to you in April to talk about the outreach that we're going to be doing to the community to try to find out what kind of things they would want in that park. Civic Campus, I'm actually not going to spend too much time on this because we're coming back with a full-blown update on January 8th at your next meeting. So more than just the rec center outreach that is underway, but really talking about the schedule, the big schedule. We'll revisit the budget to let you know how we've got this funded again, just remind everybody. But we got the City Hall space assessment, which I believe is part of the Civic Campus. We're going to be kicking off that work in January. And so we'll have the architect in here to figure out how we can repurpose some of the area down here when PD and courts move out at the end of the year, next year. The Citizen Relations Management System, we're very, very close. I met with Bob today on getting a contract done on that. We're going to work on the code enforcement element of that first and get that rolled out in the first few months, and then we'll be coming back and show the software to you probably in April, and then we'll be kicking that off citywide. And again, to remind you what this will enable all of you to have access point into essentially the CRM system to add things that you're hearing about. You can direct citizens there. We're talking about a mobile app feature as well, little geocode things. Very, very cool technology that will tie in perfectly with our brand new website and our rebranding. Neighborhood Engagement Program. This is the brainchild of our planning director, Brooke, and they've been talking with Tom Carlson, our neighborhood services supervisor, getting ideas from a lot of different cities. We talked a little bit about, I think, what Arvada is doing with some of their community engagement. So this is part of a bigger program that will be coming back in the spring to talk to you about as well. And believe it or not, we need to plan for the 50th anniversary of Northglenn in 2019. So that means we have to plan for that in 2018 so we can budget for it appropriately. So the chief's got a cool challenge coin that he's designing, for that to commemorate that, which will tie in perfectly. So really cool stuff coming with the anniversary. Homeless Task Force, again, we had another meeting yet today. So we'll be coming back January 8th in executive session to be talking to you about that, some of the legal issues around that, and of course the Adams County Homeless Coalition that is being formed. They've been meeting pretty regularly, but I'd say they're really getting some traction in the last few weeks now that the county's actually hired somebody to do this work as opposed to just a collection of different staff from different cities. So more to come there. HEAL program initiatives, we'll be having an update for you on March on that. That is an ongoing project, but we have new initiatives for this year. And again, that's healthy eating, active living. It might be on your acronym list somewhere. Sustainability program. This is more internal focused right now, but the idea is that ultimately we can do things for the organization and how we manage the city, that we can roll some things out citywide. And we'll be looking at April, May study sessions to come and give you an update on that. That's really a 6-month project that's going to complete probably in June. So we're really close on that one. So here's the organizational development program I mentioned. And these are really all tied together the way I look at them. Again, I don't put one over the other, so I'll take them out of order, if you will. Development of a mission statement and organization of values. Excuse me. We actually met as a leadership team and came up with some value statements for the organization. We're actually going to be talking a little bit more tomorrow and spend a little time on that to make them simple, memorable, hold everyone accountable for those behaviors, if you will, in the organization. So we'll be updating council on those things in the future, probably at your retreat. Related to that is a very simple mission statement about what we're here to do, again, as the organization. And hopefully tying off the goals that you're going to be looking at, maybe resetting at your retreat. Operational levels of service. I would just point out a couple of things that I've already focused on here. The O&M for the Justice Center and the O&M for the Rec Center, because we got 2 brand new capital facilities we're looking at, or they're in the planning stages. And if we can't afford to operate them, we've got to reset our expectations a little bit. So O&M for the Justice Center is going to be coming up relatively soon because that building's obviously opening and we need to plan in the 2019 budget for that. And then the engagement with the consultant for the outreach for the Rec Center, part of their task and their scope was to do a preliminary O&M based on the building that we're planning. So, but it doesn't stop there. It's looking at every single department and how we can be better, how we can provide good levels of service. And I think the CRM system is actually going to provide us some really good data as we get into it as well. Succession planning. I would love to have our leadership team stay here forever and today, but that doesn't always happen. We've also got middle managers that might be leaving the organization at some point. So this is not something that's prescribed at this point. It's really more reactive as we hear about things or as we are planning for things, people leaving the organization. We've got to develop those new leaders and identify opportunities for them to grow before we just throw them into a management role or an interim position moving forward. Compensation philosophy and performance management. These are really 2 that are tied together very explicitly in my mind. Every year we seem to have this discussion during the budget internally of we've got all these competing demands, we have more budget package requests than we have money available, and I want to be very thoughtful about how we're doing our compensation philosophy so that it's not unknown to employees year after year about how we're addressing a merit raise, a market adjustment, and then we can be very strategic about that in the context of what we can afford. But the idea that maybe a one-size-fits-all merit raise is not the best for the organization. We should have something tied more to performance, where we want to encourage everyone to be an all-star in the organization, but we know that most people are going to just be high performers and very successful here. And so how do we move people and motivate people to get into that all-star category, if you will, of being rewarded with compensation. So we're at the infancy stage of that right now, but of course working very closely with Paula and Jason and the rest of the leadership team to develop that over time. Economic development, again, marketplace stabilization, revitalization was a top priority for this year. And we were very, very close to the incentive agreement with the new owners of the marketplace. Urban Renewal was not able to reach agreement with them last week, so there's a special meeting coming up Wednesday night at 4:30. We think it would be a very short meeting just to act on the agreement. So as soon as we get that drafted and finalized, of course you'll have access to that information. We'll get it out to you as soon as possible after the meeting. Huron Center, Believe that all businesses are going to be open in 2018, which includes the Arby's, the AutoZone, and the yet unnamed grocer. I know you perked up your ear for a minute. But you know, if you've been out there and passed the site, they're moving. They're really going to be ready to go here, and I expect they're going to be doing a lot more pad improvements with the Arby's relatively soon. You'll see some vertical there. A lot of the others going to be more interior. Industrial Park Wayfinding Program. This is more of a summer activity, and it's again to address Irma Drive as well as our industrial businesses on Huron, and try to add more wayfinding there. This is actually a budget neutral because we're actually going to have those businesses pay for that signage. So really help them out, but to have them get some skin in the game as well. Neuraland redevelopment. This is actually the property south of the Malley Center. A company called The Courts is coming in to look at a gymnasium facility with some retail. They're in their due diligence, which actually ends in April. And then Carl's Farm, of course, is a huge undeveloped area left in the city, about 60 acres. There's some transit-oriented development opportunities on the north end by our M&O facility. We actually have a meeting tomorrow with their consultants to go over the entitlement schedule for 2018. So they have a lot of things they're trying to get done this year, this coming year, and so you'll be seeing a lot of these things come in front of you as they go through zoning and platting, and the idea of a metro district potentially as well is on their list. So, government policy, I'm not going to spend too much time on this other than to hit a couple highlights. We are going to have an executive session on January 22nd with our Water Council on water policy administration. And largely it's a primer for all of us to go through what our water rights are, the different sources, and to give you a chance to ask questions of that attorney in a confidential manner. Capital project financing, I would say, is an ongoing thing, and really it's going to be a retreat topic as you look at the CIP every year. Historic preservation initiatives, we've got an update planned in April on those. And Xcel Energy needs a new franchise agreement. So I'm already working with Preston Gibson, our rep there, as well as Mr. Hoffman. And we're planning a study session probably in March where Preston can come in and kind of give you the lay of the land before we get into the intense negotiations. I don't expect that you'll be taking action on that till 2019. It does need to go through PUC, and so we'll move that as fast as we can. But it doesn't expire for a little bit, so we've got some time. All right. The other comment I wanted to make here about the zoning code, this is actually a project from the 2014 strategic plan as well, also known as the Unified Development Ordinance. There is a task force that has been developed. They've been working on this for a while. The former council saw module 1 of 3, and so we actually held out module 2 until January 8th, where we're going to talk about zoning literally for a couple hours that night. It's really the meatiest part of the book. And the schedule is then to adopt this sometime in 2018. Related to that, we have a zoning map update where if some of the zone districts are changing on specific properties, we may need to do some legislative rezoning, which actually be city-initiated rezoning. I, of course, have some procedural concerns about that because I've been through that before in another jurisdiction, and it's very important to communicate to the public what their property rights are before and what they are after, and make sure that they do not change. Otherwise, they get very uptight about those things. So we're going to be very thoughtful about that. And then really, the Administrative Zoning Manual is actually a document that will be adopted by all of you, but it will be used by the Planning Department on a day-to-day basis to administer the zoning code once adopted. I think these last two might spill into 2019. All right, here's the first half of the list of the transportation-related issues. So traffic calming. I want to say, again, for the public and for all of you, in case you're getting calls, we do have plans for Melody Drive public meeting is January 25th. Becky, do you have a time on that? 6:30? 6:30 to 8:30. That'll be at Northmore Elementary.
Can you repeat it one more time?
Yes, January 25th, 6:30 to 8:30, Northmore Elementary. Claude Court is going to be February 8th, and that'll be at M&O, Maintenance and Operations Building, same time, 6:30 to 8:30. Then we'll be looking at 112th Avenue and Livingston Drive after that.
so we don't have specific dates on those yet. But we'll be coming back to give you an update on those first 2 meetings on March 5th. And to let you know what the public has said and identify the improvements and if you need to dedicate some funding for those improvements. The bike ped mobility or Connect Northglenn, the final plan will be shown to you on February 5th. We anticipate that that will be then adopted in February as well. The next few items here are really related to that bike ped mobility plan. We've had a corridor plan on and off for about 10 years. It's never been adopted. So that, I think, is a relevant piece to the bike ped mobility plan. One of the items from the strategic plan, the Complete Streets Ordinance, and the citywide streetscape improvement program, those are 2 different things. An ordinance would be, what do we want the street to look like? So it could be a traffic calming related thing, could be a bike ped striping plan. And then the streetscape improvement program is, how do we want the non-traveled way to look? Do we want landscaping, fencing, those types of things? And so all of them are related together. We think we need to have some group discussion about that. Again, we'll try to do that on February 5th. Residential street program, this is our annual program that we use to improve all the residential streets using the PCI or Pavement Condition Index. We do the Pavement Condition Index every few years, but I think last year was the first time we used this laser, if you will, mounted on a van, so it took all the human error out of it. And so the next time we do it, we're going to have some really good data that'll be reliant on what we did last year. One thing I will comment about that, I think we probably realistically need well over $1 million into our residential streets every year. When I arrived in 2016, we were putting about $400,000 into that. We're going to use the Adams County transportation tax money to boost that to $750,000 in 2018. Again, baby steps, but we can start to make some headway on this. Then it's going to save us money in the long term, not having to rebuild these entire streets. And then RTD Fast Tracks, the IGA. This is specifically the improvements that we have on 112th in York that we'll be working on with Dr. Cog, as well as Thornton and CDOT. But also relates to any updates that you need on the status of the line. I know we got people attending the NADA meetings now, and of course Dr. Cog meetings. So we'll continue to update you on that as necessary. And I just wanted to show this. Jason did a great job of meeting my deadline to have the budget books for you tonight. So thanks to him and his team. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on the budget. I just want to show you this. It's a real simple snapshot to see the fund summaries and to let you know all the big major different funds that we have. So of course the general fund is what we run most of the operations out of. Conservation Trust Fund is also known as lottery dollars. So we specifically use those for parks capital projects. CDBG, you'll see is blank there, but I would just mention that we are a pass-through entity for Adams County. So Adams County is a direct entitlement of community development block grants through HUD. We get around $200,000 a year that we can program for things that meet their consolidated plan. And without getting into a lot of the details, it either has to have an area-wide benefit or an individual benefit. Individual benefits are much harder because then each person has to prove that they're low, moderate income to be able to get those things. Capital Projects Fund, you can see that that's basically our CIP fund that carries over year after year. And then we have 3 enterprise funds, as Mr. Hoffman was referring to. We have a water and wastewater fund, which is water and sewer combined. We have a stormwater fund. And then we have a sanitation fund, which is the trash. So the trucks, the people, everything is paid for out of the sanitation fund. So I told you I'd bring you back to this picture again. So looking ahead to your retreats, February 3rd, really that'll be the kickoff of your priorities for the 2019 budget and the work plan. But hopefully I've demonstrated with some of this discussion here tonight that if you identify some things that are multi-year efforts, we're going to get working on those right away and have study sessions on them and keep things moving because we've got a plan for the next year's budget, and we might have to do some things that need your input before we can move too far down the road. So I would just give that as a caveat. Then we're going to immediately go into kicking off the budget process. I think that starts in April or May for us. And one of the things I will also do, I did this last year, I'll come back in April and give you a retreat debrief.
So here's what you've said, and here's the progress we've made in the intervening 60 days, if you will, to let you know how we're making progress on those things. There will be extensive discussions in the summer about the budget. So you'll have department level presentations from each of the department heads, and of course I'll present the final recommended budget. And then there's really a couple of months where we can go back and forth in a more discussion before we finalize that in October, which again then is fall, and then it starts all over again. So any questions on that? I know I talked a lot there before I dive into the retreat. Let me do this if I could.
Promising you no bunnies, no, not gonna get somebody who throws horses at me and stuff.
That's up to you.
I have a strict no horse throwing rule.
Pine cones?
I was a pink elephant, I'm sorry, it felt like a horse.
What I've handed out to you is a front and back, pretty simple retreat agenda. And one of the things that I did not put on the slide here, but I've got there right at the start, is that we'll have an exercise to kick off of where you want to see Northglenn in the next 5 to 10 years. It's a really good high-level visioning kind of conversation, and it worked out pretty well last year, I think. And how we did it differently is that I made this the first item this year, because after that we wanted to talk about the city council goals. And do you want to refine them, modify them? And what our idea was is that we were going to come in with some alternatives for you to look at, so it won't just be a blank slate. Obviously, you're going to wordsmith them how you want, but really comparing what we have currently and what staff came up with, and maybe some variations of those, so you can really have something to go on, and hopefully come out of there with some new goals that we can play off of. I'll have Jason give his 15 minutes of revenue sources, foundational information about the budget, what we've already got committed, if you will, some big projects, things like that. And then we're going to spend the rest of the morning talking about the 2019 work plan and really talking about 2018 projects. They're already on the list. They're probably going to carry over. I mentioned a few of them here tonight. And really the idea is to come out of there with some high priority projects that you want us to really start to use to drive the budget development for 2019 and going from there. I think last year we got a little convoluted with the CIP and the work plan discussion at the same time. So I've already coached the facilitators, if we use the same people, that let's do a break at lunch and let's talk CIP after lunch. I think it will make much cleaner discussion because it's hard to think about the work plan and not think about big capital projects. But so we'll probably, mark those and then come back to them after lunch, kind of thing. Yes.
Just mine, because I like working lunches. The 45 minutes is a long time to have a lunch out at the fire station.
45 minutes is not long enough.
Oh, no. You don't want to be in these
We're out in the
things.
middle of BME.
So I suggest, and it's up to everybody, but I would prefer a working lunch so we could, it's a Saturday.
I think
to get home.
we did it last year. Didn't we do a working lunch last year?
We did.
Yeah.
We're good with
But
that.
we voted like right before lunch and said we were going to do a working lunch.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I mean like the 15-minute.
Yeah, that's
break
okay.
and
I'm
then-
just
Get your
talking
food
45
and
minutes.
then we get rolling again?
Well, because we lose momentum, also.
That's right.
I mean, 45 minutes, we lose momentum, and we got a lot to kick out that day.
That's right. Okay. Definitely, we can do that. That's easy. That's easy.
So can I challenge that just a little bit? And I could just be harping on the word retreat, and in my world, it's more fun than this list. And so, yoga retreats.
You are an educator. It's not yet, but I think the foundational piece that can transfer is
Team building.
rapport building. We don't have to go crazy, but I think that's the purpose of a social lunch as opposed to a working lunch, is to connect with one another as people so that we can work really well together as a team moving forward. And so I get being done early too. This doesn't seem like we're going to be done that late anyway. It does read more like a really long meeting
instead of,
It is a long
but,
day.
but I think, I don't know. And I facilitate these and I plan these all the time for hundreds of teachers, and I really do think that adult learners
You need to have time. You need to have brain breaks, just like kids do.
have time to socialize and get to know each other. That's my,
And that's a good thought.
I personally would like to just, have a working lunch. I think a shorter break is fine, but 45 minutes, it really, after a while, you kind of lose the momentum of what has been going on throughout the morning, and then people kind of just break off into their own little areas, and you lose that, so.
I don't think it's a matter as much as getting out of there early because
No,
we,
and I'm
I'm so sorry I didn't see your hand.
No, it's fine.
as a new council member, I would actually really love to see more breaks and more time to get to know each other. I don't expect us to do trust falls, but I do think that like any amount of time that we can spend building rapport and not diving in such a deep way to every tiny little thing without some space, I think makes it a whole lot easier for me as somebody who's newer to be able to process everything that's happening, because these are not small things. And I know that we all value our Saturdays with our family, but this is really the one day that we're all together really setting priorities, and I think it's really important, and we owe it to our position and the people who elected us to be thoughtful and intentional and take the time to really do this right. So I'm all about spending more time together at lunch. I'm all about adding a happy hour or figuring out some way that we're doing a little bit more team building instead of just closing the books and being done for the day.
Yeah, and I think that was going to be my question, is what part of these agenda items currently is kind of focusing more on the team building aspect? Because one of the biggest things about working together as a team is trust and a common purpose, and so I think that's something that we still need to establish, and I think it would be a great time to try and figure out how to do something during this day.
And I almost see that, and I didn't raise my hand, but I almost see that in the beginning of the
Oh, the brightness.
or, wherever your icebreaker is, I don't know. There's a lot of things that have to be covered, I think, and maybe it's a different type of gathering if you want to do more team building, but this is more work related. I mean, and really trying to get everybody up to speed of what's going on, because we've got a lot.
Yeah, my only comment was the 7:45 to 8:30, you got 45 minutes in there that you could use for some of that socializing, getting to know each other, and use some of that time to break some of the ice. Not necessarily arrival and welcome. I mean, what is that? Hi, let's have a little team building, a little something right at 7:45. And just kick it off and get to know each other a little bit better.
I just want to add a little bit that I really felt that last time when we did follow this type of agenda, that I know it looks really dry as you're looking at it, but some of the topics that we talked about, especially, where do you see Northglenn in the next 5 to 10 years, I think people really, we all talked together about what we see, goals. I felt like we really worked together on a lot of the topics. So I thought there was a lot of team building actually last time we did it, but I know that you also mentioned that maybe we would do something the night before as a social hour. So that's another thought of having a social hour the night before the retreat.
Yeah, I didn't include that on the agenda, but Mayor Dodge is correct. We're in other jurisdictions I've worked at, we had a social dinner the night before. Sometimes brought in guest speakers. I know Sam Mamet from CML has done that for me before. We've had the facilitator come in and do some event around dinner that was not this stuff. So I guess I'd throw that out if we want to insert team building into the agenda on Saturday, or even if you want to do something on Friday night.
I'd be more willing to do, I mean, not more willing, but this part, because it gets so confusing and so in-depth and everything, you know, and we do interact. If we're going to do something like that, I would prefer it to be the night before, for the team building element of it, only because I know how I felt the last 2 years that I went to the retreats, and it is overwhelming. I mean, not overwhelming. It's just a lot of information to take in one day. That's where I see it. My own personal opinion is I would rather do it the night before for a dinner, get together, whatever. But of course, you know, majority rules, and whatever we choose to do, we do.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. So my quick question too is, all of the senior staff obviously be invited to do the dinner the night before with us, or how would that work? If we did a dinner the night before?
I would think so, yes.
Okay. So, the night before dinner, or like after the event, to have a dinner or happy hour is kind of what we're thinking. As I said earlier, I mean, if everyone can attend the night before, then that's a good idea, but then.
Kind of puts me in a weird place. Sorry, I don't.
My experience too is that after spending all day together and having, you know, good but sometimes intense discussions, sometimes people are just ready to call it a day on Saturday. The night before sometimes works better as a precursor, kind of get the energy up for the next day. But
Well, I like the idea of the speaker too. I think that can kind of really set the stage for the next day to come. Excited, so I like it. Really good.
So I'm kind of opposed to the idea of dinner because it's not something that we budgeted, it's not something we planned for, and it's a big expense. So I think it's one thing to have somewhat of a social gathering, and then when you start bringing in question of having staff, I just think we didn't budget for it.
I think that's a great idea. I think if budget is an issue, I'm sure we can figure that out. Either us or we just go. I don't know how that would work, but I think we need to have something. I think there's too many new people versus too many veterans, and I think we need to start coming together, and I think a social dinner sounds awesome. The speaker sounds perfect. You mentioned facilitators outside of yourself. So I'm just maybe a little plug for process time, because kind of going back to what Jenny said, we've all said this is a heavy day. If we don't have breaks, I'm telling you, it's not going to sink in. So we need to be tending to the adult learner and not just tending to adult business people, I think. Because if we're expected to learn all of this information and take it in and process as a team, then we just ask the facilitators to do process time together. That would be great.
Well, even if you do this, if it's cost that's keeping it, I think if maybe if we did some appetizers and then we were responsible for our own dinner, I don't really know how the cost about that. I think it's important that we have an event like that.
I'm okay with appetizers versus a dinner.
So can I just kind of try and get a consensus here? How many are in favor of having the dinner the night before?
Yeah, I've got a conference and I'll be there from Wednesday through Saturday, but I'm cutting the Saturday to come to the retreat, so
So you couldn't be there the night before?
I'll try, but I can't guarantee it.
Can I
So-
see the show of hands again? We pretty much got the consensus here at the beginning. Or some type of social activity that night, Friday night.
and the idea of a speaker, or even have our facilitators come in and maybe even do some fun icebreaker thing over dinner, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say thank you for the opportunity to have dinner. I think that's really important. You know, I fully recognize that our agenda is going to be intense, and I just want to renew my request that we have a little bit of time for processing, whether that's, you know, maintaining that break for lunch, or adding in, 15 minutes breaks after some of the more intense sessions. The other thing that I'd really love to see, and if this is too touchy-feely for a lot of folks, that is just fine, but some sort of program around, how we all manage conflict, what our leadership styles are, so that we can try and identify how we can work better with one another, because at the end of the day, we're a team, and our city doesn't move forward unless we do that together right here in this room. So if there's a way to kind of do that, and I would defer to the facilitators, but I think that that's a really important piece that I'm seeing that's kind of missing, that, a couple of icebreakers and, appetizers is nice, but it doesn't really get to who every single one of us is and how we manage those different conflicts and leadership styles.
I would just have to add that to me it's just sounding like two separate retreats, because now it's just getting very agenda heavy, both on the touchy-feely and on the work retreat. So I'm not sure that you can put all that into a night before, because that sounds like quite a bit, but anyone else have any other suggestions?
Jenny would add something.
I know that other municipalities do this in very different ways. Some of them have 2 different retreats, so maybe that's something that we could look at. But I think that, just given that we've got, a handful of newer folks and a handful of veterans, I think any way that we can integrate our team, we should be doing that. So if that means 2 separate days, great. If that means trying to make it work in the one that we already have budgeted and set aside, then that's my preference too.
I think it sounds great, but I think that we have to look at the money that we have and spend our residents' money wisely, So we have to be really careful with that. I am open to anything, but I believe that it could be 2 separate meetings, but they're very expensive. And there's other ways that we can spend our, our constituents' money, our money, to do other things with the city. I mean, I'm totally with you. I think that the team building would be a really good idea, but I would like to keep, our focus on, some of the focus on the money that we're spending, I know that dinners are nice, and I know that, all that is, but that comes out of our budget, which comes out of our constituents, they pay for it. So I'd like to just keep that in our minds, especially when we start talking about getting another retreat in there for team building. Perhaps there's another way that we can come up with a team building idea as a group that does not apply additional cost to the city's budget. I'm just not for that.
We'll just have to think about it.
Is there an additional cost to having our facilitators stay an extra hour or 2 hours? How are they budgeted? Do we have them for the entire day? Or is it just for like 5 hours here?
It's an hourly basis, and so the incremental cost of having them there Friday night is probably not that great. A lot of their work is going to be spent in prep with me ahead of time, and then a post-meeting summary that they're going to be providing written documentation of all the whiteboarding and stickers and markers that we do that day. So the incremental cost of having them there on Friday night is probably not that great. Clearly there's an additional food cost if we're talking about a dinner. But it might make sense from an economic standpoint to have the facilitator there the night before, because then they're getting to know all of you as well, and then it'll make them more successful the next day.
Couldn't that same argument, though, be applied to us spending more time together? If we spend more time together, we're ultimately going to be successful.
Sure.
I think we can set cost aside and have a discussion about whether or not we agree that it's a meaningful opportunity
To come together and learn more about each other. Because as far as facilitating, I don't believe, and I'm just going to paraphrase and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe Jenny was saying we do all of these things. I think she was giving options, right? Leadership, inventories, I could do the color scale if you want to be simple, but there's really short, simple ways for us to learn about one another that don't take time and that don't cost money and that any one of us can facilitate. So I don't think it's about cost. I think it's about do we believe that it's something that would be valuable for us to move forward as a team? And if we agree, then I think it's very simple to find ways small.
So I'm just wondering how you would interject those. Are you thinking now that that should be inside the agenda? Is that what you're discussing?
Some
or?
of them can be very short. I still like the idea of a social dinner because I think that sets morale, that values all employees. I think it has a lot of value. The agenda here
Is tight with content, but as Antonio mentioned, there's 45 minutes right at the beginning. There's a 45-minute lunch. And there's a wrap-up if you want. In my world, this is not a long day anyway. So there's time built in for short activities. None of these take 2 hours. None of them take more than 30 minutes. And some of them can be even shorter than that. So it's not hard to put just a couple little getting to know you, connecting activities, some sort of leadership personality thing to kind of get to know each other with our style of leadership or our communication style, because I think that's really important to the work that we do together. So I really do think it can be built in without cost as an issue. I think we just have to decide if we agree that it's a valuable focus.
So I would say, to have the beginning integrate some of the things that Meredith's talking to, ask the facilitators if it's possible to add a few short getting to know type exercises to the retreat day, see if that's possible, without adding too much onto the agenda. And how does that sound with everybody else right now?
And we have icebreakers before on the agenda, so
And I think that sounds great. That sounds like there's some agreement with that approach. I would also add that these times are not fixed. They're going to move as the day goes, and we might spend more time on other things, and they might look at y'all and say, "Oh, y'all need a break right now," and we're going to stop and take a break. So it will be flexible in that regard. But yeah, I'm going to meet with them on Thursday, and I can definitely run all this by them and probably shoot out an updated agenda to all of you. Maybe we can talk about it briefly on January 8th at the next meeting too. I would, just to plug for the facilitators, it's two individuals that formerly were with CH2M. Now they have a company called I3 Integration, Scott Hergenrader and Charles Cram. I think they affectionately like the Laurel and Hardy thing. It's kind of funny the way they're one's a short guy, one's a tall guy. But long story short, they both have done a lot of capital project bond programs, Denver Better Bond Program. They did some things in Commerce City, other places, and so they come from a perspective of they can do team building, they can do icebreakers, they can do capital projects. They've got a good gamut of experiences, and they've built a lot of things too as project managers. So I think they're a good match for what we're looking for, and so I'll be following up with them this week. So.
And I actually just want to add a few thoughts. I really feel that there are a lot of councils, and I know a lot of them being on CML, and not everybody is always going to agree with everybody else. And they're highly functioning. They understand that you have to work together for your community, and I believe that can be done here too. Sometimes it's easier for new councils just to get together and just gel, figure out what it's going to take to gel without saying we have to get together and we have to have these dinners and we have to do this. Sometimes people need space, and then things will gel, and things are just going to generically happen. But I just feel that as a council, when we're moving forward for Northglenn and doing things for Northglenn, it's going to happen, and I don't see any problems there. Every time there's an election, new people are elected to a council. I don't know how many times, Joyce, how many times have you been on a council with new people elected? We've never had to have any types of retreats that, you know, we've done this team building type things. Maybe that's wrong, you know, maybe this is just something new. But I also feel that those councils worked through their issues, and either you came to an understanding or you didn't. And if you didn't, it was okay. You still can work together. So that's, I just wanted to throw that out there.
We can just, we have had icebreakers and different activities to get to know each other during these retreats. We just didn't call them, icebreakers. We had different activities, so. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jordan.
I just want to echo what Meredith and Jenny had said. I mean, I think it's nice that they want to get to know the other council members and get to create some sort of consensus and work together. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table, and I look forward to doing it for this retreat.
All right. I have one final slide. Joanna already promoted the CML conference, but there's some additional CML training if you want to take advantage of that, and Susan can get you registered if you want. There's a webinar coming up here in February that's free. There's actually an all-day workshop, which is, again, very inexpensive, $85. And then there's, you probably know about the spring outreach meetings more than I do, but there's statewide, there's free trainings, and they're happening in May, essentially. So there are going to be a lot of other opportunities to get non-city staff stuff thrown at you. And I definitely promote CML. It's a great conference. So that's all I've got. So thanks for the feedback on the retreat, and open for any final questions you may have.
Questions, comments? No? Marcy?
Questions specifically about this, but I'm just wondering, in advance of some of the snow prediction stuff, is it possible that we could get some social media just highlighting how we address snow removal so residents understand the process? Just a little refresher.
Yeah, it's we haven't had snow for it seems like forever, but yeah, now is the time to get that stuff out there, the snow map, and it'll be plowed what we don't plow and why. So
It's a good idea.
That was a great idea.
yep, you got that.
Well, before we adjourn, I'd just like to say Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to the staff and the council, and thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Mayor.